Bulavinaka to the team at the Fiji Council of Social Services, who have been working really hard to get practitioners and experts in the public finance management area to spend the time to come and talk to us today about this really important conversation we need to be having ahead of the release of the Fiji government budget. We are just looking at our chat panel right now to make sure that all of our speakers have come back online and that we can actually get them to join in this conversation. We are waiting on our friends from UNDP as well as our supporters from the European Union's Pacific office, and we're hoping to hear also from friends in other civil society organizations who are working in this space with us. And so just very briefly, I must at this point already say that I am just a journalist here to facilitate a conversation between some very hardworking people who are trying to get the concept of Sautu. I must apologize at this point that I have not taken the time to get the Hindustani meaning of the word Sautu into this conversation today. And at this point, I will just send a shout out to Padre James Bhagwan, who has been helping me to try and translate the word Sautu. But we talk about Sautu because we talk about the well-being of people. And the origins of Sautu rests in our ability to cope. It can be coping at an individual level. It can also be coping as a community and as a country that constantly face disasters of the natural kind and of the medical kind that we're doing right now. Coping is important. And this word Sautu, in its connection to public finance management, began about a year ago when the Fiji Council of Social Services conducted a livelihoods impact assessment into those most vulnerable of our communities and to look at how their lives had changed as a result of the pandemic, but more so as a result of the economic impacts of the pandemic. And so everyone that volunteered to conduct this survey happened to be Itoke, of Itoke origin. And so as they came about capturing the stories and the experiences of those who were on the ground and struggling with the pandemic, the idea of making well-being the center of decision-making in the area of public finance management became very real for these young people who were conducting the survey. And so they spoke about Sautu because in the Itoke language, Sautu does not only relate to wealth accumulation, but it relates to your spiritual well-being. It relates to your community and your cohesive ability to get through life's challenges together. And so we were inspired by that. By we, I mean the Fiji Council of Social Services and the CSOs who work with the Fiji Council of Social Services. And of course, they go into the hundreds when we're talking about FCOS and its DCOS networks. And so when you add PIANGO and the work they do in the region and the NGOs that they work with, then the idea of Sautu becomes very clear in terms of our economy and in terms of what we want economic focal point to be. And so this Talanoa today brings in some wonderful speakers. It brings in a former governor of the Reserve Bank. It brings in public finance policy makers and motivators from international organizations such as the European Union and such as, of course, the people at the United Nations Development Program and the Pacific Office who fund a lot of these initiatives and the consultations around it. And so we've been grateful that despite very short notice, we've been able to get some great speakers on board. And they are now, I've just received indication, they're now all in the room. And so we're about to get this conversation started. So first up, let me introduce to you Savenaca Narube. Savenaca Narube is, of course, a lot more people know him now as the head of a political party, but he has been the governor of the Reserve Bank and therefore brings a unique perspective to the kind of policies, to the kind of economic policies that can put cash at the center of decisions, or that can put people at the center of decisions. And we are very excited that he was able to say yes at the very last minute last week and agreed to talk to us about the kind of access that he was privy to and the kind of policies that this government and every government that we work with can consider. Up next, of course, is Aisake Casimira, a long-time practitioner of public finance management, but from a very grassroots perspective, currently working, of course, in the theology space. Aisake has worked in and around civil society development, working with vulnerable groups for a very long time. Marine Destrez, Marine, my apologies if I haven't pronounced your name correctly, is, of course, our friend from UNDP's Pacific office and also a very important resource personnel when you're talking about being more dynamic and innovative in the public finance management space. And then our friends, Emeline Siale Ilolahia from PIANGO, otherwise known to everyone working in CSO as just Siale. I must also pay them some credit this afternoon because it is because of them that we've been able to get this Zoom conversation on a roll. And of course, our host, our actual host, by which I mean the Executive Director of the Fiji Council of Social Services, Vani Catanasiga, whose team has put this initiative together and whose team has been driving public consultations in the area of public finance management. So just before we get back into this and invite Mr. Savenaca Narube to the microphone, I would like to, on behalf of the team, thank you again very much. To all of you who have joined us today, who have spent the time. We are overwhelmed by the support and your presence here today, and we do apologize for the technical difficulties that have delayed us a little bit. So without further ado, Mr. Narube, you now have the mic and we're excited to hear from you.
Hello, thank you everybody. I hope our technology has been all done and you can hear me. I thank you, of course, for this opportunity to participate in this program, and thank you very much, and your partners as well. I have a few minutes just to make general comments on the issue that I have been given to talk about to you this afternoon. It's an interesting issue of this Sautu, a word that you have decided to use in this dialogue. I mean, it's to me, what is Sautu? And I think a lot of us know that in the Itoke language, it means plenty. It means the absence of lack in our families, in our own personal situation, as well as national and community. I think it talks about the equitable distribution of gains from growth. And this is one of the biggest roles in the budget, to redistribute the gains from growth. When you talk about the narrowing of wealth disparity in the country. And I think lastly, of course, the more you access people and individuals access these services, which flows out of the budget, it's very, very important. And I've been given that topic to talk about, which is the access, greater access. I mean, access to what? We all have understanding of that. I just want to say, okay, firstly, access to economic opportunities through jobs, through businesses, through credit and other facilitators of income. Access to social services of health and education, infrastructure, roads and shipping. I've noted that in your submission on the budget. Social protection, humanitarian protection, particularly at this time, law and order, justice, and so forth. But there's a host of other things that when you talk about access, you would be thinking along these lines. But we are packaging it under PFM in this Talanoa session. And we all know what PFM is all about, I hope. Its center of it, of course, is the budget, but it is much wider than that. It includes the policies that underlie those budget allocations, the accountability of how you spend money, the integrity of the systems, and of course, the scrutiny that comes to it. But why are we budgeting? We are only budgeting because of insufficient resources. Imagine if there were not, resources were plentiful, we probably won't need to budget. So the national budget, PFM, allocates these scarce resources to the many expenditure needs of government, and the expenditure needs are many. And to allocate these scarce resources, you need a basis of it. And to me, that basis is prioritization. You must prioritize rightly. And these priorities shifts over time. They are not static, particularly now during this crisis. What is our priority? You know, all spending by government in the budget must be appropriated by Parliament. It's under the Constitution, and the PFM Act requires that. So when we talk about access to government services like health, education, infrastructure, and so forth, they flow through the budget process. So we are at the front of this budget process now for the next budget. So we must engage government, all of us, on budgeting. The point that I want to stress in my brief introductory comments is, how do we engage this government effectively to listen to us, if possible? I think we need to package our intervention or our submission properly. When we talk about access, I think it's better to look for indicators of access. If you're talking about health, what is it? Is it doctors per capita, or health centers per capita, or for water? How many people have access to clean and reliable water? Poverty, where are the indicators? And once you start with that, then you look at what should you benchmark these indicators about? And to me, the best way you can do that is compare across the Pacific, where we are dealing with the region, as well as countries that have the same kind of economies and as we do. And then the third thing is you analyze the trend. We in Fiji may be doing well, but you see other Pacific Islands may have caught up through the years. So how do we see government's priority in PFM? Just look at the allocation. To me, the priorities should be there. If government is talking about something that they prioritize, it should be reflected in the numbers. And many times, I don't see that. The government emphasizes priorities here, but when you actually look at the number, it doesn't reflect that. So look at the numbers that underlie that priority and compare that with what has happened in the past, in previous years. Priority, as I said, shifts over time. Right now, we're dealing with the COVID crisis. So what are the priorities there? It should be health. It should be perhaps humanitarian aid than other things. So we should look at that, the government priorities. And once we do that, then we have a picture of where you should be focusing your intervention or your submission to government on this. And I just want to end, if I may, to sharing this couple of screens with you. Oh, this has been disabled, but I'm fine with that. But that's my introduction to that. Access is so important to the Sautu theme that you have, and our involvement in that budget is so critical to allowing us access, and we do that through a proper submission that looks at the priorities of government to understand where the emphasis lies. I can end there. Thank you very much. Glad to discuss further or answer questions. Vinaka.
Vinakavale, Mr. Narube, just before you go, I'm going to send everyone now a very quick reminder that I probably should have done at the very beginning. If you have burning questions for each of the speakers, we will let one or two come in at the beginning, and you can send that to us by chat. We can see it and we will ask that of Mr. Narube. But otherwise, we will now move on to our second speaker, Mr. Casimira, and ask everyone to please send your chats through either directly to me if you would not like it to be a full view of everyone, and you can give me one or two questions immediately after each speaker, or wait until the 35 minutes allocated for Q&A at the end of this Talanoa. Mr. Narube, thank you so much, and we do apologize for the lack of tech support at the beginning. Please mute your speaker now, but stay in the room because we can't wait to Talanoa with you some more. Without further ado, I'm going to ask Mr. Casimira to please take the mic and give us your 7-minute presentation to the point, Vinaka.
Thank you, Lice, for that, and thank you, Mr. Narube, for that, for those brief words about public financing. Sorry, I'm trying to work out my camera, so if it comes on, then I can show my face, but if it doesn't, then you just have to bear with me on that one. I've been asked, and thank you, of course, Director, for the invitation. Thank you for organizing this Talanoa session today. I think it's timely to be able to talk about what is, I think, essentially a fundamental concept for Fiji as it recovers. Hopefully it will recover. But thank you, of course, for picking it up. Remember the first time I heard it as a concept used in Ratu Semi back in 2018 at a philosophy conference that was hosted here in Suva. That was before he passed on. And gladly that, of course, has taken it up to as a model, not necessarily only for economic recovery, but also in terms of how do we navigate our way forward, especially so in the midst of the pandemic that we're in right now. But I'll restrict my comments to what I've been asked to talk about, and that is to do with transitioning the economy. Now, that is a tall order. But the couple of things that I wanted to share, and if I can perhaps share a screen on this one, would that be all right?
I'm afraid you don't have that capability right now, Mr.
Okay.
Casimira.
Oh, no worries then. So what I'll talk about is a couple in three components. One is basically to provide some ideas on how we move forward, or how Fiji navigate itself out of this pandemic, and not only that, not only survive, but has something fundamental to work on. And the first frame that I was thinking of is that in order to move forward, and the transition period is then what it what is to be the framework for it? What is the framework? And I think, of course, it's provided a framework, I call it the Sautu framework. And in knowing that, there needs to be an understanding, perhaps across the board, of what the framework is about. The second thing, what are the indicators of that framework? And I had about four of those broad areas in which indicators can be developed out from, but they are colored. One is green. What are the green indicators? And also to do with the forest, the resources that forest, the rivers and the streams, etc. Then you have the brown indicators. That's to do with the soil and the land, the rocks and the mountains. Those are possibly brown indicators, if you like. And the blue indicators to do with the fish, the coral, and the reefs and marine life. And the purple indicators that do to do with human relationships. And that's important to consider because purple, why color purple, is because it's a gender one. I'm not talking about here, I'm talking about women. It's across the board. And it's meaning that our indicators currently in terms of economic and development are mostly skewed towards the male gender. And so we need to be able to, in terms of Sautu framework and the indicators, be able to develop indicators that are more gendered and directly in terms of a development and that. And so from your framework and your indicators, then you move into what you call transitional strategies. What are those? Again, following the colors, what are the transitional strategies to do with the green color? That's to do with agriculture, health of forests, and all that stuff. What are the transitional strategies to do with the brown? Soil health, land use, etc. And similar to the blue and to the purple. The purple, that's crucial because you're talking about the health of the population, talking about policy making, talking about markets, the financial system, transportation, all of which are mentioned in the survey that, of course, is produced. And by the way, those notes and that analysis of that survey was really good. Then on the third component, in terms of transitioning the people's economy, you need to have something like a community indicator setting. And that's to do with going out to the villages of the communities and running workshops and training on how the communities should be able to map their resources. And not only that, but to produce indicators on the four colors: green, blue, brown, and purple. The second thing about strategies to resilience projects, one of which is the community indicators. The second project that could be addressed is what are the national measures of economic health? Right now, we are depending on the GDP to tell us that our economic health is either up or down. And so in terms of transitioning, you need to be able to factoring what other measures in addition or much more important than the cash or the income of a country right now. The third project that might be able to assist, we call it Ngona Mai Liu financing. You know, we often hear this phrase to say that Ngona Mai Liu meaning the future, but also meaning the past. And so the idea is in financing, framing that kind of financing is that if the government is to finance a project, the village has to demonstrate that it has indigenous knowledge in it, that it has methodologies and science built into their projects, right? But it also has an indication that the future generation will be protected. And so the idea is that you're looking to the future with the awareness of the past. You build in your financing criteria in which community projects can be financed that way. The fourth thing about the people's economy is agriculture and land use. You need to be able to, in terms of agriculture land use, that there is much more investment, not only in terms of cash. I think people had to invest in their land, in their forms of agriculture, their wisdom, the traditional and indigenous wisdom into how to do farming. And they know it already. It's there, it's part of their tradition. Now, with regards to financing, is that they will be able to access financing, which Narube had been talking about, with regards to these kinds of projects, if these projects demonstrate such things. And then you need to be able to, for the last one on these resilience projects, is to rethink trade and market. What is trade and what is the market? Now, there have been a lot in terms of the analysis put out by FCOS in the survey. There has been a lot of recommendation regards the accessibility of resources to do with government and what it should be doing to the communities. Now, that is still working on the framework that we are dependent on government to be able to do these things, the provision of financing. But the idea is that if we're going to rethink trade, we need to be, and markets, you need to be able to rethink policy making, and that's crucial if you're going to transit to a people's economy. The idea about, in terms of community setting with regards to from strategies to resilience project, community indicators setting is much crucial to the transitioning of the economy. If communities and villages say that these are their blue, green, purple indicators, and if provinces were able to do the same and take the indicators of development or financing from the communities and villages, that is a big statement with regards to budgeting at the national level. And that's important. If there's going to be any transitioning, meaningful transitioning in the future, community and village indicator setting is very crucial to it. I think my 5 minutes are up. Thank you, Lice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Casimira. Thank you especially for elaborating on the conversation about the need for either gender-specific or gender-neutral work when you're talking about resource allocation. Vinaka, we're now going to move right on to our next speaker, and according to my list, that is a Public Finance Management Project Officer at the United Nations Development Programme's Pacific Office based here in Suva, and so that is Maureen Destrez. Maureen, welcome. Thank you for making the time, and you now have the mic.
Thank you so much, Lice, and thank you so much all for joining in today. First, I'd like to make two disclaimers. One disclaimer because I am a foreigner in Fiji and hosted by Fiji, and I'm very grateful for that. The second one, because I'm an international civil servant. So my first disclaimer is that this is a very culturally rooted discussion that we're having today. And the reason why I accepted this invitation as an external participant and as a foreigner in Fiji is because very often culturally rooted discussions tend to assume that we all have the same understanding of a concept and that we all agree and that we all understand each other when we say things like Sautu or well-being or purposefulness or wholeness. Sometimes it does take a foreigner misunderstanding the concept to actually generate a meaningful discussion about this concept, about what we mean for it. So I hope I've misunderstood meaningfully and I enable this conversation to go forward that way. The second disclaimer that I like to make as an international civil servant from the United Nations Development Programme is that no matter what is said in my participation in this event does not represent a judgment of value on the Fiji budget. There is no one way or the other that the UN is promoting this budget to go, but we are responding to the government's offer and the Fijian government call for public participation and for more engagement on guidance, on discussions, on the priorities, and where the money that the government is managing on behalf of the citizens should go. And this is in that sense that UNDP, thanks to the support of the European Union, has been working together with PIANGO and AFCOS and has been engaging and supporting those conversations to happen. So with those two disclaimers, I'll make 3 points. And I think the first point about money and well-being has been well addressed by my two co-panelists. Then I'll make 1 point on social services, because this is the thing that AFCOS has asked me to focus on today related to their budget proposal. And then I'll make a 3rd point relating to health and access to health, because this is very much what the core of the proposal on social services focus on from the budget submission that AFCOS has put together. So regarding the first point on money and well-being, or money for a purpose, we're talking here in the context of Fiji about Sautu well-being and what it means to allocate priorities within a budget. This conversation at the international level has been going on for a very long time. 30 years ago, the Human Development Report from the UN called for well-being index and well-being budgets to be put together. We know that there's conversation about reforming these GDP indicators, and my two co-panelists have been highlighting the importance of indicators and how we should to evaluate our success and our performance in contributing to this well-being and to this success. Bhutan has proposed a happiness index. The latest Human Development Report from UNDP also proposes a completely different way to calculate wealth and development. And this is an ongoing conversation. In the region, in the Pacific, New Zealand has recently innovated by creating a well-being budget 2 years ago, where every single investment and every single line of the budget has to explain how it contributes to the overall priorities, policies, and well-being of the population in New Zealand. This is one way, maybe, to look at, and one model to look at in terms of the indicators and in terms of how we frame that conversation about the relationship between money and well-being within a budget document. Now, I think something that has been highlighted already is that the amount of money we have per capita, or the GDP per capita, or how rich a country is, has very different meaning depending on what the country and the population, the citizens together, decide to do with this money. I come from Europe, and what COVID has made extremely obvious in Europe over the past year is that equally developed countries have taken radically different choices in the way they have invested their money. Just the number of hospital beds per inhabitant is completely different between Germany and France. Now, both those countries could have invested the same amount of money in hospitals, but they decided to do it very differently. And I think this is exactly what we're talking about here. How do we invest our money, and what do we define by this well-being? The second point that I wanted to make related to social services. Now, another thing that became very evident with COVID-19 is that every country, one after the other, had to define what they meant by essential services. This has just happened, sadly, in Fiji, where we know that the government has had to identify the businesses that were providing essential services to the population during the lockdown. No one has been surprised to see health workers identified as essential workers and to see the hospitals continuing to work even during hard lockdowns. But in other countries, and I guess with some people in Fiji, we've always been surprised to see that another essential service has been waste management. People picking up the bins and the garbage have been identified as one of the most essential services in society. Now that says a lot about the state of our consumption and the type of economy that we're living in. But that also says a lot about the services that we depend on. And if I've learned one thing listening to the conversation that FCOS and the DCOSs have been having over the past year, and I've been incredibly honored and grateful to be able to listen in to these conversations, is that I understand that the concept of Sautu and the concept of well-being also relate to a concept of interconnectors and connection between people, communities, families. Now, the connection we have to the social services has become more and more apparent during time of COVID. We depend on essential services and we're connected to the states. No, I think what is incredibly important is that another thing that has been identified as essentials during the lockdown is not only the state services, but also the services that we get from the connection to others. For example, food exchange in border containment areas have been allowed by the government. Banks have been identified as frontline workers. This is because the connection between members of family, between communities, is also an essential services and an essential connection in the society that should be facilitated by the government and by those that are structuring the way we interact with each other. The last point I wanted to make was about access to health. And this is something that the budget submission of FCOS focuses on quite particularly. And it highlights that there's a number of neighborhoods around us, because I'm assuming that a number of us are in Suva, and I'm assuming that it's the same situation in most of Fiji, that do not have access to healthcare. Now, access to health and how much we invest in health in a budget is a reflection on how much we value lives and how differently we value different lives. So it is also a reflection on the inequalities within our society. It also is a reminder, and I think this is something that came very apparent when I read FCOS's budget submission, that inequalities in the Pacific are not only geographical inequalities. We have a tendency from an international perspective to see the Pacific and only to see isolated islands. And when we talk about access and inequalities, we tend to focus on geographically those that are the most marginalized and isolated and how they can actually reach services. When you look at the budget submission, you actually see that the most deprived communities and some that are asking for the most help are right next door. They're in the suburbs of Suva, they're within Suva, they're around the big cities. So it's not about geographical marginalization, it's about the marginalizations and the broken links that we've created within society in Fiji and everywhere. The last thing that I'll say, and something that I find incredibly important, is that this focus on access to health is also about the type of investment that we make for our future. And this is where, and this is what we've talked about already, about relating the investments of today and the future that we want for tomorrow. We all know that it makes economic sense to invest in prevention and to invest in the health of the entire population to prevent some costs in the future. That's a very dry and a very sad way of looking at health. But I think it does make sense to bring back the economic discussion in a discussion about the budget. I'll stop here. Thank you so much, Lice.
Marine, and my apologies, I have just been alerted that I've been pronouncing your surname wrong. We are going to leave all of the questions to the end so I can give all of our speakers the opportunity to speak now. A big thank you to everyone that's joined us. The audience keeps growing and we're grateful for your participation. I see the questions coming through via chat and the team is looking at it as well. We're compiling it and it's going to be a very dynamic Q&A Talanoa that we have after this. So next up on our list of speakers is none other than the Executive Director of the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs. So that's PIANGO, and it's Siale, and it's Siale's team that's working with us as well. Now, of course, Fiji Council of Social Services is a Fiji national affiliate of PIANGO, and so the two work very closely together to get the global concepts with local action going. So Siale, you have the mic.
Thank you, Lice. Pulovinaka, everyone. I will try to be very brief because I know that there's a lot of people who are can't wait to ask their questions to the key speakers. When we are talking about resilience building, and I'm talking from the experience of PIANGO with the public finance management projects that we are doing across the region in 5 Pacific countries: Tonga, Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu. As part of that, for the past 2 years that we had worked on this public finance management, we had managed to, with the support of UNDP, convene Parliament civil society budget briefing, where they allowed civil society to be in the room and they present the budget discussions. And what we have found across the 5 countries, that when we're talking about what has been missing, what is it that build our resilience, our coping mechanisms, that is related to women, related to how young people are responding to the different crises, the people with disability. Apparently across the board, those are the key questions that are often asked by civil society of the government budget. The lack of gender budgeting, the lack of clear indications in allocations for youth development, the lack of allocations and budget support for people with disability. So when we are talking about resilience building, it's really interesting to see the gaps that we still face when it comes to public finance management. But at the same time, what we also know in our own system, that when we talk about resilience building, we are talking how we build the capacity of our people. We are also talking about the capacity of our system, but at the same time, we are also talking about the capacity of our different institutions in preparing ourselves to respond to the crisis, climate change or COVID-19. Those are the systems that help us in terms of preparing ourselves to cope with all the challenges that we had. If I could just have a look at the budget submissions that has been submitted by the FCOS family for the Fiji national budget process, it comes out quite clearly that they're looking at how can we empower our community better in terms of training, looking into fostering volunteerism. They're looking into having more constructive dialogue when it comes to government doing consultations on different issues, including relocations, capacity building of community to lead or manage their evacuation centers. At the same time, they're also looking into their natural resources with the understanding that the natural resources is their resilience base. Yeah, we have seen that now with the COVID-19, a lot of people have now lost jobs. They are now getting back to the natural resources of their community as their basis of recovery. And of course, they are also identifying resilience infrastructures that can help them make sure that they cope with the different crises. However, when we were looking into the public finance management system, that's the whole idea of these projects, is to make sure that we simplify the technicality of the citizen of the budget, and develop a citizen budget guide that help engagement of civil society in the national budget process, and EFCOS and their national network in Fiji had gone further down to communities and take consultations around how do they understand, how can they simplify the processes as well, so people can actually participate in that citizen budget process. that's resilience building. Because at the end of the day, participations of our citizens in how our resources in terms of budget, country's budget, need to be make sure that the voices of our people are part of that. I think my final point in terms of resilience and resilience building and in the context of the public finance management is really looking into the different institutions that help build our community resilience, build the support of our people's resilient to any crisis. And that can be also regarded in terms of our traditional institutions, where we have seen that really speak to the leadership of some of our traditional institutions, our churches, some of our traditional leaders network, how they responded in their villages, in their community. Those are the institutions that we also need to recognize. The local government, and if we look across the region, common across the region in the 5 countries that we work, the lack of investment of government allocations of the budget that goes down to recognizing those institutions in supporting of our community resilience. My last point is that an ongoing conversations around how do we deal with our natural resources. When we know that there's somehow in an informal way, that's an organic way, that's where our resilience, our people's resilience are based. Yeah, but then when we are starting to talk about public finance, we have to be quite mindful that we don't start putting dollar signs to some of our natural resources that it's become a commodity. That is far more than looking into the resilience of our community. Lice, I'll stop there. I hope to give time for the questions. Inaka.
Malo, Siale, thank you so much for that. I have got questions that are lining up for you especially also, but we're now going to move right on ahead to our final speaker of the panel, and that is, of course, the Executive Director of the Fiji Council of Social Services, Vani Catanasiga, and I'm going to ask Vani to speak to the point, but also especially just to give us a very brief snapshot on what it was that AFCOS asked for when they made their budget submission to the government. So for those of you who are joining us midway or later in this program, the budget submissions had been due on the 12th of May. There was some indication and maybe even an announcement that that due date was going to move further down the line, but we can't be sure at this point. And so we're estimating that we're going to hear from the government, or rather get the national budget sometime between the middle of June to early July. That's going on, of course, the situation last year, and it was already in the middle of the pandemic. So without further ado, Vani Catanasiga.
And thank you for those who have tuned in today, and thank you for bearing with our technical glitches. But very briefly, as Lice had asked me to do, you know, you might be wondering why we settled on the 5 themes of access, resilience, which Siale had spoken on, you know, economic recovery or transition to people's economy, social services, which Maureen spoke on, and what I'm going to speak on now is on inclusion or leaving no one behind. The 5 themes were really determined after we had done divisional consultations. We had done 3. We had done 1 in the central, which was done together with the Eastern Divisional consultation. We had done 1 in the Western Division, and we had completed that series of divisional dialogues with a Northern Divisional dialogue on budgets and public finance management. And so what we did was at every divisional PFM workshops, they were called, at the end of it, we would make submissions, so the district councils of social services in those particular divisions, and, you know, civil society organizations that were present in these divisional dialogues sat together to look at what were the priorities for the communities that they had worked in or they had come from. So when we came at the national level, when we pulled together all of the 3 divisional submissions, we saw that there were 5 clear themes that were running throughout this, and the themes that we had discussed initially. And so for me, speaking on inclusion, for FCOS, the discussion on inclusion has always been tied to understanding vulnerabilities and people's coping capacity. And I know Siale spoke a bit about this, is, people's ability to cope with, the different pressures that communities, citizens often face in their daily lives. We know that at FCOS that not all people have equal control of power or resources, or have access or have the same level of access to resources. And so for us, it's really about making sure or ensuring that, when the budget is being put together, these considerations are also made. So as I explained before, when we conducted the 3 divisional workshops, issues on gender, which I know Nolin has really posed a lot of questions on, gender inclusion, disability, child protection, aged care, also brought up from CSO reps. And these are, traditional inclusion things, but also we could see that there were particular themes that were emerging when we looked at, issues on resilience or climate change or disaster. We were also hearing about the need to also include informal communities, informal settlements. I think, to really bring what is perhaps the priority for those who work in this area of inclusion. I think, one of the main discussions coming out of, or the main themes coming out of this discussion is there's an agreement that the easier and more convenient approach for governments has been to design and fund programs that have blanket approaches. But these are completely devoid of the nuances, and there's a lot of vulnerable people behind. And I want to also pick on what Maureen has highlighted before, and this is to reiterate that, there is, those traditional vulnerable populations that we often look at, or categories that we often look at, but there's also an emerging cohort of new vulnerable populations, if you like, due to the broken linkages in the systems, the bottlenecks in government's public finance management systems. And when FCOS conducted the livelihood survey in 2020, we found that, these are communities that have been impacted by cyclones. Last year we had 3 cyclones. And by the time COVID had hit, they were really, the issues that were present in these communities was, really exacerbated. We're talking also about non-FNPF members. We're talking about female micro-entrepreneurs. These socially marginalized, socially excluded groups. So female micro-entrepreneurs who don't have, or who may have FNPF, but don't qualify for the COVID-19 support that government has availed. People who live in subsidized housing, people who live in informal settlements. These are socially excluded communities. How are we then, the question that came from the surveys and the discussions that we had at the divisional levels was, if the public finance management system is going to work for us, how do we make sure that our realities and our issues are also considered in this 2022 budget? And I think I'll leave it there because there's a lot of questions and there's a lot more discussions coming from the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Nakavalevu. Vani Catanasiga, Executive Director of the Fiji Council of Social Services, who are our hosts for this Talanoa today. And so I'm going to now just very quickly check back and ask my colleague from FCOS, Josiah, to just check up on all of our speakers right now to be sure that they're online, because I do have lots and lots of questions. Thank you to all of you who have come here seemingly very prepared to ask questions, and those who have been inspired by the conversation today. So our first question, and this is one that's going to everyone, all of the speakers, but maybe not Vani Catanasiga. And this is to do with the FCOS submission to the national budget, which, as I said earlier, we're expecting government to release sometime in late June or up to the middle of July. And the question is, the Fiji Council of Social Services main message in their budget submission has been to advocate for an urgent reprioritization of resources. And that includes attaching the importance of access, particularly for those who are currently not part of the process. And so in each of your presentations, you've talked about the different parts of access and the different parts of engagement that needs to happen so as to put Sautu, or the well-being of communities, at the center of this budget process. But the question now to each of you is that if the Fiji national budget process was to be more meaningful in its engagement, what would it look like to you? And so I'm going to go around the room and ask each of our speakers to come on and speak as they will about this particular topic. Should there be meaningful engagement, one that looks at the reprioritization of resources and one that gives more people access, what would it look like to you?
Is that to me, Lice?
No, you're the one person in the panel that this question is not being asked of. It's being asked by everybody, of everybody else.
Okay, great.
Hello, Lice. Let me start.
Thank you, Mr. Narube. Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Narube.
Yeah. The budget process and the allocation can be quite technical to many of us who are non-technical. And I was talking about earlier for the engagement of everybody into this process. And I note the submission by FCOS on this, and I fully agree that the inclusion aspect of the budget is something that is not very transparent in most budgets of government. Allocation can be quite important in total, but you must drill down to the programs and even the specific allocations that are in there to have a sense of where is this going in terms of inclusion. I fully support that. My only comments is that please back up your submission with some indicators of what you're talking about. For instance, if you're talking about informal housing, perhaps numbers there of how many people live in informal housing and where are they. Those kind of data would really help if you are doing the allocation of resources. The non-FNPF members, where is their support, income support is coming? Where would you find that in the budget? It is not going to be obvious in there. You have to drill down a lot to the relevant heads to get a sense of that. Thank you. Hello.
Thank you, Mr. Narube. Thank you very much. Mr. Narube, while we still have you, there was one question in particular that was that's being directed at you. You spoke about the need for more transparent engagement between government and civil society, or government and public as a whole. What sounded a little bit like criticism of this government for their failure to be transparent. Can you tell us, as someone that's had access at the highest levels of budget formulation, what does access look like? What does meaningful dialogue with the government look like from an economist's point of view?
Yeah, thanks, Lida. An effective consultation is a two-way traffic, as we all know. It has to be both ways. And I think at the moment, you see most of the traffic is one way. And when the budget is delivered, you hardly find any kind of signs of where your issues have been tucked away on. So I think the government should also tell us, if anything, of what they think of our submission and how will they deal with it. I think that would be very, very useful feedback for everyone. Thank you.
Mr. Narube, with regards to well-being or Sautu, and of course lists a few indicators as being hallmarks of well-being, what do you see as being the good well-being indicators against the current measure of progress, or GDP?
Yeah, I think you can't just take one indicator to cover everything. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of indicators. So I think you have to have a package of indicators. At the top end, of course, you have your production, your income, which is GDP. You know, you really need to look at distribution of that GDP. How is that flowing down to the people? So you need to supplement that with your social indicators, the access that we have been talking about. And you need to, if I may suggest this, to, of course, try to build up a database on those social indicators that you talk a lot about when you make your submission to government on the budget. The health, the education, the water, the roads, poverty, and so forth. This would be, quite to me, a more kind of down-to-earth indicators that determines the well-being of the people. Not so much the GDP issues, but I think that those success indicators that we have been talking about, that'll be quite excellent to start building up that and highlighting that in all the forums or the submissions that you have with government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Narube. And so, Aisake Casimira, if I can keep you online, Mr. Narube, while we ask Aisake to unmute his microphone and just come back on. Aisake, you spoke a little bit, and you had indicated you could elaborate later on in the program about, what it might look like, what other well-being indicators we could all be working towards, or we could all see as a measure of progress, as opposed to the current traditional financial indicators that the GDP is measured by. Could you talk a little bit more about your work in that area, please, Aisake?
Yeah, thank you, Lice. To pick up a little bit, I think on the issue of participation at the national level on budget preparation or consultation, I mean, currently, I think everybody knows that it's at the whims of government. If they want to ask people to participate, they will participate. But what's the basis of participation? I think, and this it's leading up to indicators, right? If Fiji has a set of indicators along the things on the environment, on financing, on GDP, on social indicators, then it makes meaningful for people to participate because they will call into question, why haven't these indicators not even progressed to 50%? achievement. But at the moment, national planning has plans, but it's never been part of the community's consultation to set up those plans and the indicators for those plans. And so right from the start, we complain about participation because we don't have a benchmark for participation. We don't have the indicators, national indicators for participation, except for the GDP. And that's what we all gear towards. Unless people like you and I and those in the communities decide to take the initiative and change that mode of participation, that would make more sense. Now, there are various forms of participation. One is the GDP, and that we do with financing, the income, expenditure, and where to put the money the next time, right? When we do budgeting. There are indicators about the health of a nation, to do with our physical health, mental health, and where money should go into. Indicators to do with the health of our ocean and our sea, our golingoli, and what are the things that we need to invest money into it. There is the indication about social relationships to do with men and women, the gender relationship, and the children's upbringing, the children's condition. There are various sorts of indicators that can be developed. And what I said about earlier, that to make that mentality change from purely GDP to other forms of well-being indicators, is that the communities pressure those. Communities develop those indicators, have that factored into provincial councils, and that's where it should be able to, because that becomes an election issue, right? It becomes a very it's an election issue for any government to come on board. Why are these indicators in the community, in the provincials, and not councils are not being achieved? Thank you, leader.
Thank you, Aisake. While I still have you here, I wanted to ask, and this was a question that's just come through now via Twitter. As we're talking about reframing the budget process, reframing it and shifting the focus, it can be about human well-being. So it can be about the well-being of the oceans and the well-being of our natural resources. Where is this conversation in terms of your engagement with government? Are you at the table? Is government part of this process? How much progress are you making with regards to getting government to reframe?
Well, the initiative and the drive for government do that is already, the environment is ripe for it, right? At the moment, if they don't take the initiative while in the pandemic right now, then a transition will not happen as it should be. Now we should be looking forward to a kind of an economic structure in the system financing, on social integration and political governance that should be different after the pandemic, or even while we're at it right now. And so the environment is there. There needs to be discussions on three things. What is development for us in Fiji? Secondly, shall we rethink about policy? What are the things that we should be basing our policies on? Purely on GDP in terms of, if we're talking about the budget only, but what are the things that we should be basing our policies on? And then the third thing is to do with education, and not only in terms of the formal education system, whereby these kinds of indicators part of the economics curriculum, but also in terms of the community education plan. And these things are crucial because they sustain the discussion forward, and then begin to shift mindsets of people on what is development, what are indicators, and what is our well-being, and what kind of policy should we be looking at. Thank you, Lice.
That question is also directed at you, Ms. Catanasiga. How much progress have you made engaging government in terms of the concept of making well-being or Sautu the center of Fiji budget formulation processes?
I guess part of why we've focused on Sautu and well-being, this is the second year that we've decided to focus on that, because we're seeing really that ad hoc, haphazard approach. What we're seeing is that there's really a lack of that big picture approach. When you work with different government departments, they're working in their different silos. And so they're not connecting, they're not coordinating their responses to what communities are saying real needs. And so for us, we've really been trying to push the idea of Sautu, because we see that there's a lack of that focus and concern. Agencies are really just concerned about delivering their outputs. And there's really not that ability to zoom out and to see whether all of their efforts collectively across the whole of government system is actually making a difference in the lives of the citizens of Fiji. So this is why we've really gone big on Sautu. Yes, there are issues with regards to how we develop indicators, how we bring everyone to the table, but that's something that we find is a work in progress. We find that at the national level, the relationships are more fraught. It's difficult to have this kind of conversations. But when we go down to the subnational level, when we sit with government counterparts that work at the subnational level, who are more in touch or who are more connected to grassroots communities and their realities, we find that there's a lot more willingness, there's a lot more openness to discussing, to looking at coming up with a solution together. And so we're working at that level, because that's where the entry point is at this time. And we're hoping that as communities engage a bit more proactively, and there's a lot more goodwill, that can, build up and like a bottoms-up approach, where it can really transform some of the dynamics that's really been persistent at the national level.
Vani, there's a question that's coming now, and this is a question for Mr. Casimira as well as Mr. Narube, if you're both able to unmute at this point. The question is, traditional knowledge is important. So traditional knowledge, the formulation of well-being indicators, just with that as background. Traditional knowledge is important, but how is it leveraged and how is it valued, both in an academic context as well as in the financial value context? I'm going to ask Aisake and Mr. Narube to please take the lead.
Thank you for that. I think it's not only academic that traditional and indigenous knowledge is being studied over here in Fiji. The USP and AFA and another FNU as well. There have been theses written about indigenous knowledge, and the practical application to develop that. And so there's no lack of resources in regards to academic side of things. Now there is somehow a lack of initiative to take the academic discussions and views into practical applications. Now, how can you do that? I mean, for example, if there is a project in agriculture submitted by a community or a village for government funding, for example, or for provincial funding, to be able to factor into that proposal how is indigenous wisdom on agriculture is reflected in that proposal, and how can it be monitored throughout the span or the life of a particular project. So financing in terms of such projects will make more sense, because you are at the same time protecting the indigenous knowledge, but you also, in terms of the future, that particular knowledge is being preserved for future generations. And so the practical application of it is in terms of the proposal writing and how it's going to be used, how it's translated into some practical mentoring purposes with regards to agriculture and agriculture project. Thank you, Lice.
Yeah, I just add to that, Lice. Thank you. I think it's so important, this traditional knowledge. It either makes or breaks many of the projects that are put together by government in the budget. But unfortunately, they are not taken seriously in the discussions on programs. Consultations, of course, are important, but they are sometimes not done. And this kind of traditional knowledge is just pushed to the side. I think we need to put some value on this traditional knowledge, put a value, and hopefully that can make it more make that discussion more serious in how we can integrate that into the program designs and costings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Narube, and thank you, Mr. Casimira. I've got a long question here, and this one is directed at all of the speakers. There are many around the world working to better recognize and incorporate the contribution of women and girls into the national accounts and financial system. So there's particularly now work to recognize and reduce the burden, as well as redistribute unpaid care, domestic and communal work in more equitable ways between the genders. It's clear, however, from evidence-based studies that women are doing 2 to 3 times the unpaid work in homes and communities, and this includes Songo. So is it possible to have better indicators on the contribution of gender, but more than that, to have ways to build effective policies that respond to women's unpaid care work? Because 1, women are exhausted from the level of work. 2, women only have a small proportion of the FNPF pension. So women taking care of families all of their lives end up in the older years with no security, no money, and less social power over property. So this leaves them very vulnerable, particularly when they become widows. So the question there is it possible to have better indicators on the contribution of gender? It is open to all the panelists.
Lice, do you want me to take a go at that question?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
A few points maybe, because I think this question is extremely important, and it relates to the first question on what can be done and how priorities are set. Now, of course, I cannot speak for Fiji, but the UN has been doing a lot of work over the past years on how to prioritize and where to invest to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 goals and 149 indicators. It's very difficult to invest and to allocate money to all of them. So how do we make sure to work towards the implementation and to the achievement of all those goals with the limited money that we have? And what we find and again is that there are certain investments, certain things that we can do in society, certain projects and activities that we can invest on that will have a ripple effect, that will have a multiplying effect, that will impact many other aspects in society. And I think again and again in all the work that I've done across the world in different countries, trying to identify priorities and points that could accelerate development, gender empowerment comes as a prime one, because we know that when you invest in empowerment and inequality, you invest in so many other things. You invest in the education, you invest in the health of families, you invest in the overall dynamics of society and the inequalities and poverty that is inbuilt in them. So I think that's the first thing to remember when you look at gender empowerment, is that and inequality, you're working on much more than just the space for women. And I think that's something that has come out through the question. Another thing that I wanted to draw the attention of the listeners to is a tool that we have that's called gender budgeting. And it's particularly interesting because Fiji is at the moment piloting it and trying to implement gender budgeting. Now, what is gender budgeting? It's simply the recognition that there's no neutral way of investing money. If you invest money to keep things as they are, you're investing in inequality, right? Because the current status of society is inequality between men, women, different types of groups in societies, different genders, no matter how they define it. So if you want to really invest towards empowerment and equality, you need to first recognize the inequalities that exist to then be able to move towards change and empowerment and equality. So it means that every single investment that we do through our budget needs to recognize and state the impact that it will have on gender and that it will have on equality. And that's something that gender budgeting is trying to do. It's incredibly complicated because it means that everyone who is participating in the budget process needs to be aware and needs to be able to assess and evaluate and input and record the impact that it has on gender and on different groups that exist within society. But this is something that Fiji is working on at the moment, and this is a tool that exists for all governments to use. Thanks a lot.
Mr. Narube, I'm going to ask you to try and answer that question.
Thank you. Gender budgeting. We had started that during my time. We had started discussion on this, and now I hear it is still ongoing. It's been a long time. It's gender budgeting discussion in Fiji. Some time ago, I did a program on climate change, and we included a program there on trying to codify what are the expenses of government that deals with climate change, the mitigation and the adaptation. And we got that through the codes that goes into, well, getting too technical, into the financial management information system of government. So it can be done. And the same thing could be done for gender budgeting. We could just code, and this requires training with the ministries that prepares their budget to, and if there's a code that can be allocated in the FMIS, for gender. And that to me could be something that should have been done. I mean, I was in finance ages and ages ago. It could be done relatively faster. Thank you.
Mr. Narube, do you see indication now that that is being done, or that at least the groundwork to make our budgeting process more gender responsive? Do you see at least the groundwork or the foundation? Do you see that happening now?
No, I'm not. I'm out of touch with what actually is on the ground. I can't possibly answer that. But if it has taken from my time, which is 30 years ago perhaps, to now, to still continue to talk about it, it doesn't imply that there's some serious effort to put this gender budgeting in place. So I think perhaps the NGOs could also use that to continue the work and complete it very quickly. Thank you.
Naka, would any of the other speakers like to contribute to the conversation around the contribution by gender? I'm seeing lots more feedback coming in. People are thanking us for how things are going. And I just have one more question to ask of the panelists. And I've just been reminded that we're now well over a half hour past our time allocation, even with a little bit of delay that we had. So we're very grateful. Thank you to everyone that have sent in their question. Now, there was a question that's come through. So this is the second last one before I go to the roundup. And this is not so much a question, maybe some feedback. And so I just want to give Mr. Narube as well as Mr. Casimira the heads up. The feedback is, I appreciate the views shared already on well-being, but I have not heard any reference to ecological well-being, otherwise known as Yaumbula. And as we now know, in COVID times, the Yaumbula have become the basis for our Mbula Sautu. So the Yaumbula, for those of you who don't speak Vosavakaviti, is natural resources and Mbula Sautu is well-being. I'm going to give the gentleman the heads up on this, and Ms. Catanasiga, if you're still there, please, some feedback to that feedback.
If I may start, yeah, I think the Mbula, the natural resources, to me, is the foundation of this economy. It has to be, because those are the resources around us. So to me, it should be central to any economic growth policies, and to develop those natural resources. And we need to see a better, clear, strategic move or plan to exploit the use of natural resources. And a very important point around this is that you take the resource owners along in that development. Thank you.
Yeah, my contribution to this one, Lice, is that it's really to do with the approach to Yambula. If we are to say that it is fundamental to our life as Itoke or indigenous people, or for that matter, Fijians, then it is possible to take the approach that the budgeting is only one aspect to it. It is merely to service the Yambula, if you like, yeah, the resources. But bear in mind that Yambula is much more than just the resources that we have in terms of the physical resources, forestry, the ocean, and other things. It's also to do with the mana, the spirituality of a place. So you cannot put a financial value to those things, but you can invest resources in terms of the finances into how you can make these aspects of the Yambula thrive. Can there be, in terms of policy, can there be, in terms of government policy, can you invest money into people learning their cultural wisdom, for example, their makers, whatever it is, right? But of course, these are all to do with Yambula. It's both physical and spiritual, and the mana that exists within the Vanua. And it's quite important to see budgeting and public financing as a service to that. If it's not a central part of our lives, budgeting financing. It is a service to keep or to improve or to enhance the Yambula that we have. Sure, we can use forestry, we can use the land or whatever for development purposes, but that is only in as far as it enhances our well-being and the resources that we have in terms of the relationships, in terms of the spirituality that exists within a Vanua or a certain place. Thank you, Lice.
Mr. Casimira. And so our final question for the day, and these are questions to everybody, to the panelists, but also to all of you, the participants who have joined us today. We would love to see your answers to this. Please just drop it in the chat feature of this Zoom and we will record it. We will also accept contributions via DMs to either my account, the Fiji Council of Social Services account, or in the Facebook page of Fiji Council of Social Services. So the question is, what do you want to see in Fiji Budget 2022? The budget that will come out in the next couple of months, what do you want to see in it? Mr. Narube, I'm going to ask you to speak first, or whoever is ready to speak, Mr. Casimira.
Okay. Thank you, Lice. I'll just put out a few issues of what I think the budget should be, as I mentioned in my starting intervention. It has to be contextual. It has to be contextual. The priorities then is to reflect the context of where we are right now. And we understand the great crisis that we are going through. So I think that must fully address the programs, especially health, that we are in right now. The second is that our economic well-being is well beyond our direct control right now. So what else can this budget do to those issues or those sectors that we have control? And I think it'll pay us big dividends in terms of the well-being that we are talking about right now, if it focuses on sectors that are in our control. Those are the immediate issues that I could raise there. I think we also talked about, of course, it's the measurement of well-being, the measurement of indicators, something that could really be useful in the discussion of the budget allocation, particularly identify what priorities are in there. Thank you. You're there.
Naka, Mr. Narube, Mr. Casimira, some parting words from you.
Well, yeah, no, just to say thank you to all the listeners and the questions that have been posed. There are many, I mean, in terms of this kind of forums, there are many ideas that can help us out of this kind of situation. Like in terms of the national budget, with the Fiji government, it's important for me in terms of looking forward. There should be an investment into alternative ways that which could, in terms of the service sector, that's regarding to tourism that has been flung, has down for a number of since last year. But they should be able to invest in alternative ways, and one of those is in agriculture, and then be able to invest in that, putting more money into creating the markets for it. I see in the AFCOS survey notes, there's a need for transportation, markets, and the fees. Those kinds of things need to be revised and reviewed so that they create a policy environment whereby our people will be able to do those kinds of things, marketing their agricultural produce. The second thing is that more than ever now, is that they really need to look and seriously think about gender parity. And so it's only in terms, not only in terms of the national level, but also more and more of the work that's now being done currently in the midst of the COVID-19 are mostly done by women. Regardless, well, in the midst of the dangers to them. And so there needs to be that investment into bringing up the women's and valuing the women's work much more highly than it is now. And the third thing is is to do with the greening of the economy. And that's now more than ever that the government needs to move into that area of greening the economy, meaning that we invest a lot more into things that are not polluting, the environment and things like that. Thank you, Lice.
Savenaca, Mr. Casimira, Siale, Vani, Marine.
Thank you, Lice. Just one point from me, and this is just related to PIANGO's interest in this public finance management work, where we believe that a lot of time the engagement of civil society in this budget process, they shy away from that because of the technicality of the budget process and the budget documents and all of that. So I'm hoping that Fiji could come up with a budget that is as simple as it can be, so that people can continue to find it that it's meaningful for them to engage. We are talking about submission now, but there is a lot more of how we are looking at monitoring, looking into our budget submission? Is there any changes in the budget? Does it reflect anything that is in the budget by the voices of the people that we had put together and submit? Thank you.
Lisa, thank you so much. Maybe just one thing from my side to keep in mind, and I think this is particularly important with regard to the natural resources and to the greening of the economy that we've just had a discussion on. In a budget, you'll find the areas where you spend money on, but you'll also find how the government is going to raise money and revenues. And that means all the taxes, all the licenses, all the side ways where the government is able to access money and to generate money for the budget. Now, we know that working on those revenues and how revenues are generated is just as important as how you spend the money, because effectively you can create barriers. If you put a tax on environmental solution or environmental friendly solution or on new businesses being created, you prevent some solutions from being created. So I think I'll just leave a reminder that working on barriers and removing those barriers are just as important as working on investment in any budget.
Savenaca, thank you so much, Marine, and thank you, UNDP. Vani Catanasiga, the Executive Director of FCOS. Just going to check very quickly and give her a dingle to see if she's still with us, because she did have something else to go to.
Still here, Live.
Savenaca, yes. So it was your budget submission that's been the basis of a lot of our conversation here. So we're not going to ask you to go over it all. But if there was something or some method or something that's on your list of burning needs and burning wishes that could be taken into account as the government formulates the budget that will come out soon, what would it be?
So for me, it's really been about resilience, resilience in its fullest sense. And I know Siale spoke a bit about this. I think that if we look at both, issues to do with disaster risk reduction, if we were to look at coping with the pandemic, I'd really push for ensuring resilience. I know that FCOS has in the past advocated for social protection floors, and I think that now more than ever, our government leaders have to be brave, they have to be courageous, they have to, put money. Usually the approach is to invest where you see major returns, but I think that investing in protecting its citizens is critical for this time. I think it's time that they begin to relook at how they investments, and I think that people need to be at the center of discussions and need to be prioritized. I think that's the call from FCOS this year.
Thank you very much, Vani Catanasiga, Executive Director of FCOS. Thank you especially for this opportunity. Thank you, Siale Ilolahia, Executive Director of the Pacific Islands Network of NGOs. Thank you, Mr. Savenaca Narube, the former Governor of the Reserve Bank of Fiji. Thank you, Aisake Casimira, whose background in CSO development in this country is very, very wide, but who is currently the Director of the Institute for Mission and Research at the Pacific Theological College. Thank you also especially Emeline Destrez, the Pacific Finance Management Project Manager at UNDP. Thank you also to our friends from the European Union's delegation to the Pacific based here in Suva, of course, for their quiet support. They're not with us on the panel today. Thank you to everyone that's been involved in bringing this Talanoa ni Sautu, Talanoa, about putting people and people's well-being at the center of public finance management. So what that means basically can be put together quite apt in a takeaway, a summary of one of the speakers' contributions today. And been writing it throughout this 1.5-hour process, and it says basically, can the governments come up with a budget that is so simple so that when ordinary people look at the process of how a government budget is made, they find it meaningful to engage in that process. So one more very important quote: don't tell me what you value. And this is to all the governments of the world, not just ours. Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget and I will tell you what you value. So on that note, we hope it's people's well-being and the Sautu and even Raramba ni KVT, everyone that lives in Fiji is at the center of public finance management. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. Vinaka Valevu.
Vinaka, everyone.
Nakavalevu, Motoka,